That underpin the approach. And intercepted such a fellow on what we do to interdict a plot that's underway. So it's not to rescue three, CIA agents.
I hope I can remain through this.
Did you injure yourself, or is
No, I just.
Please take your seats.
All right, I will keep my distance.
you don't even have to shake hands?
Okay.
If everyone could please take their seats, it's time to begin the next panel. Thank you very much, and welcome to panel 6 of our conference on freedom and preemption, strategic considerations concerning preemptive action in Iraq and beyond. In this panel, we have two eminent debaters who are going to discuss the costs and benefits of preemptive action in Iraq and elsewhere. As all of you know, President Bush has made preemptive action, or the possibility of preemptive action, a part of the Bush doctrine in foreign policy. Hopefully we'll discuss the circumstances when preemptive action might be used, whether its use in Iraq was justified, whether the use of preemptive action might be justified in future situations confronting the country, such as Iran, and whether the administration has done a good job of balancing the desire to take preemptive action against the importance of reassuring our allies and bringing our allies along with us. We have two very distinguished debaters with us today. The first speaker will be David Rivkin, who is a partner in the Washington office of Baker and Hostetler. Mr. Rivkin is an alumnus of the Reagan and first Bush administrations, and he's written widely, including for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and National Review, and he's a longtime friend of the Federalist Society. We also are very honored to have today Professor Alan Dershowitz, who is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law here at Harvard Law School. Professor Dershowitz has been a longtime friend and supporter of the Federalist chapter here, and I know he's been spent a lot of time with students in our chapter here. He is most recently the author of the book Rights from Wrongs, The Origins of Human Rights and the Experience of Injustice. He's had a very distinguished career at Harvard, beginning teaching at age 25 and having been appointed a full professor at age 28, the youngest in the law school's history. And he has also, of course, made a name for himself as one of the leading defenders of civil liberties in the country today. So we will begin with Mr. Rivkin.
Thank you, Steve. It's my pleasure to be with you tonight. I should confess, however, that I'm not a professor, despite the honor which I've been accorded in the list of speakers. I also know that we have a buffet to follow, and it's always tough to be standing between the audience and good food, so I'll try to be extra pithy. And I would also save Iraq-related discussion until my rebuttal. I'll talk about things at the broader level. As you well know, the Bush administration has drawn more than its share of criticism, both at home and abroad. And even within that fairly contentious universe, the Bush Doctrine, the so-called Bush Doctrine, promulgated in a series of speeches after September 11 and finding its sort of fullest expression in something called the National Security Strategy of the United States, which is a White House prepared document, has been a particular target. Now, the doctrine is fairly simple in its formulation. It states that when faced with a gathering threat, the United States will be prepared and will use military force before the threat is fully matured. And as those of you who have looked at military history and strategic studies can appreciate, Bush Doctrine is really a form of strategic preemption. Now, as is often the case these days, those issues are rarely discussed outside of a political vortex. The doctrine has been heavily criticized during the 2004 presidential campaign. At the time, Senator Kerry articulated what has become one of the more nuanced objections to strategic preemption. He claimed that strategic preemption basically is always an option, and that However, the United States should not announce it publicly as a matter of national policy, nor make it a centerpiece, a public centerpiece of our security strategy. Now, obviously, many of administration critics have gone beyond that, but even that formulation, I think, goes too far. In today's world, treating strategic preemption like a proverbial crazy aunt in the attic, always looming in the background, but not discussed and not seen, is not sufficient. I would submit to you that preemption must be at the core of our security strategy and must be publicly articulated as such. Now, to put things a little bit in perspective, let me first say that the administration's open embrace and usage of preemption is not as unprecedented as some critics have suggested. A vivid modern example of this policy trait is the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. As those of you may recall, in order to prevent the installation of Russian offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba, the Kennedy administration imposed a so-called quarantine on the island. This action was publicly justified by senior administration officials up to and including President Kennedy as an act of self-defense. It was directed at the Soviet ships delivering nuclear missiles, and it was really an act of war. It was a belligerent act under international law, even though significantly no actual attack has been launched by the United States, and that attack, I would argue, was not imminent. Both sides were operating in the context of nuclear deterrence, and Khrushchev's real purpose, we understood it at the time and now, was to shift the strategic balance of power, not to start a war. And nevertheless, President Kennedy chose to preempt that threat, even though it had not yet matured. Now, why do I think that, despite this venerable pedigree, publicly articulating the necessity of preemption is a good thing? Well, I think we're living in fairly unique times. If you look at organizations like Al-Qaeda and similar entities, look at the way they operate. The only sure way to successfully prevent their attacks is to act months or even years in advance. For example, consider this. If the United States had toppled the Taliban regime, or even killed Mr. bin Laden himself sometime in 2000, during the summer of 2001, I would argue that it would not have necessarily prevented the September 11 attack. Most of the perpetrators had already infiltrated the U.S. and needed no further instruction or assistance from their superiors. In addition, of course, Al-Qaeda and groups like Al-Qaeda are not subject to the ordinary rules of deterrence. Their aspirations are messianic. They have no easily identifiable assets that we can put at risk. However, their ability to function, their ability to be effective, very much depends upon the assistance of regimes that do have something to lose, no matter how rogue. Creating a certainty in the minds of the rulers of such regimes that embarking in a particular course of action would bring about a swift and certain regime change may, not certainly for sure, but may be sufficient to dissuade them. Indeed, even those rogue regimes that do not exercise full control of their territory, if sufficiently persuaded that the U.S. would not tolerate their support for entities like Al-Qaeda, may endeavor to be helpful. Accordingly, despite endless assertions to the contrary, preemption is not antithetic to deterrence. Instead, I would argue the threat of preemption broadens the range of conduct to be deterred. And it's very important, from a use of force to a whole set of other activities. And I would tell you that the broadening of his conduct to be deterred, to be prescribed, is a good thing, given the nature of today's threats, when various seemingly benign activities, like supporting religious charities, giving money to universities, or pursuing peaceful nuclear activities, can sort of seamlessly morph into terrorist attacks and WMD stockpiles. I believe that this new salutary strategic arithmetic, if you will compel potential enemy to prove that they do not harbor terrorists. And the burden really of production and persuasion, as lawyers would say, should be upon them, not upon us proving that they do not have something. Now, the administration's much criticized public and robust articulation of preemption, it certainly was robust, performed yet another indispensable function, dispelling an impression of American weakness. Now, you could sort of chuckle and say, what weakness? We're the world's greatest military, economic, and political power. Unfortunately, it has not been the view of our enemies. Indeed, the entire cargo of Islamic fascism, religious intolerance, theocracy, sexual apartheid, and political repression basically has very little resonance with the world at large, except for their tenet, a key tenet of that school, that the affluent West either cannot or will not defend its culture, and therefore is particularly undeserving of a global stature it enjoys. And they're not all that wrong. It's not crazy to espouse this view. If you look at several decades' worth of American retreats in Indochina, in Lebanon, and Somalia, our failure to respond, except for fairly ineffectual law enforcement methods to Hezbollah and al-Qaeda attacks in American buildings, embassies, warships in the 1990s, our seeming toleration of kidnapping and torture of American personnel, all those things have fostered an impression that, to use Osama bin Laden's charming expression, we're a weak horse. And I would submit to you, I believe this was the view of this administration, that erasing this impression is critical to any reclamation of credible deterrence. Now, there are a couple of other reasons, albeit domestic, but fairly important for the public U.S. embrace of preemption. Now, the September 11 Commission has told us that one of the key reasons we failed to take the battle to al-Qaeda was a certain modicum of bureaucratic resistance by both the CIA and DoD against engaging in what they believed to be difficult and controversial paramilitary operations on foreign soil. This institutional foot dragging was reinforced by a particularly debilitating legal regime associated with clandestine actions which grew out of various past investigations of CIA abuses. In this context, a public affirmation by the U.S. government at the highest level that embraced the legitimacy of strategic preemption, combined with a well-accepted view that wartime operations are subject to a distinctly different legal regime than peacetime clandestine actions, did much to lift this pernicious bureaucratic fog. Not completely, but it was somewhat successful. And there's also no important matter in our unique American body politic of legitimacy. I don't need to call it de Tocqueville for you, and the linkage between public policy and the law. And it was just essential to publicly articulate and inform the American people about the desirability of preemptive options. To put it very simply, in an environment where we're expecting to use preemption as a tool of statecraft, the administration had, in my opinion, to justify publicly doing so in advance instead of just doing that sotto voce. Now, there have been some criticisms which I'll quickly run through, which I find particularly unpersuasive. The critics have claimed, for example, that announcing a strategy of preemption is somewhat destabilizing, effectively giving the green light to other states who might use force promiscuously. And sort of the reasoning here suggests that the states not otherwise inclined to using force will do so because they've been given, a green light by the Bush administration. I think this criticism is silly, not to put too fine of a point of it. It ignores the reality of international relations as ascribed to the United States and influence I only wish we had. States use force when they judge it to be in their national interest and invariably claim that they're doing that to meet a threat posed by the adversary. And the Bush doctrine certainly did not change that. Even if they use it for propaganda purposes, the danger of that and the cost of it must be balanced against the nature of the scope of a threat we face if we do not engage in that. Now, the last argument I'll run through quickly is the notion that our embrace of preemption has alienated the international community in general and our dear European friends in particular. Now, ideally, of course, a deterrence policy should foster both strongest possible dissuasion of one's enemies and while eliciting the warmest regard from one's allies. I would say to you that unfortunately, and to be fair, the strategy of preemption has not done that. Unfortunately, this kind of a state of strategic nirvana has not existed in the past, rarely existed as ever. During the Cold War, for example, America and Europe has had long-standing contentious differences about this very issue, the nature of the proper content of deterrence policy. We, from 1960s on, argued that the best way to deter the Soviet Union, who believed that we can fight and win a nuclear war, was to buttress deterrence with credible warfighting options capable of placing at risk those assets that Moscow held most dear, primarily their political and military centers. Our European allies, by contrast, stubbornly clung to the notion of assured destruction, which eschewed warfighting approaches and claimed that making nuclear war as horrible as possible was the right thing, and what we were doing really did not reassure them. In fact, they pretty much hated it. Guess what? A number of American administrations, both Republican and Democrats, chose to emphasize a robust deterrence optimized to deter the Russians, even at the cost of unsetting our European friends. Briefly, perhaps more of a point, it is far from clear to me that European criticism of U.S. policy would appreciably abate, even if Bush doctrine was never publicly articulated. I think the differences between us and the Europeans reflect a fundamental dissonance over the nature of a threat in a post-September 11 world and its root causes. We've been advocating the promotion of democracy as the key goal. They've been advocating the promotion of stability. That aside, public opinion in Europe, whether at the elite level or public opinion level, exhibits enormous aversion to all uses of military power, whether of preemptive or reactive variety, as demonstrated, for example, by the palpable European distaste for Israeli efforts to defend themselves during the recent rounds of Intifada, or the claims I most recently heard from a senior visiting German official that September 11, while terrible, was a great crime and not an act of war. These are not new differences. They've been developing for decades, somewhat subsumed during the Cold War. in my opinion, and again, we don't have time to get too much into it, sort of a myopic reaction to the carnage of the two world wars in the sense that nothing is worth fighting for and dying for, as well as European military weakness. That is also quite palpable. I should also point out to you that the European opinion about this is quite eclectic. Interestingly enough, the Europeans at the time in Bosnia and Kosovo strongly supported the use of preemption. In fact, much of international law professoriate and a lot of the UN mandarins even coined the term duty to prevent to describe the need to use military force preemptively to stop genocidal despots. Eventually it dawned upon them, certainly by the time of the Iraq debate, that it was the United States that was the most obvious beneficiary of strategic preemption, and they somehow changed their mind because I suspect that a number of them view the task of managing American power more important than dealing with the threats posed by rogue states. To summarize, publicly articulating the doctrine of strategic preemption, far from undermining deterrence, makes it more robust and should be an indispensable component of American statecraft in the 21st century. And if deterrence, however buttressed, is unavailing, the execution of preemptive option is the best way to assure our security. The arguments against preemption are fundamentally flawed. They're not even directed at preemption as such, but are driven by a number of other imperatives. Thank you.
Professor Dershowitz.
Thank you. That was a brilliant and very persuasive speech in many ways. And I'm going to agree with some of it and disagree with some of it. I'm sorry for my hoarse voice and sitting down, but I got out of a sick bed with a bad flu today, so you're going to have to accept me as I am. I've just completed a book which I sent to my publisher called Preemption, A Knife That Cuts Both Ways, so I could talk on either side of the subject. Because I think preemption is sometimes a very positive aspect of foreign policy and sometimes not. I also think preemption has to be seen in a much broader light than just military preemption. There are many forms of preemptive self-defense that are being used and should be appropriately used in the fight against terrorism. Some of them are less than full military engagement, like targeted killings of combatants like Osama bin Laden and others who would be appropriate targets. Others are forms of preventive detention. Even the issue of rough interrogation is a form of preemption, and preemption has been with us throughout history. What I want to do is first distinguish two general categories. One, preemption, and the other, prevention, or preemptive wars and preventive wars. And this is a distinction that currently is being talked about quite a bit in international law. A new commission appointed by the United Nations Secretary General has come up with a report suggesting this distinction, and roughly preemption, which I think almost everybody would agree must be used in appropriate cases, is an attack that simply anticipates an imminent, certain, and disastrous attack from one's enemy. The paradigmatic example of a preemptive attack would be Israel's destruction of the Egyptian Air Force and the Syrian Air Force in 1967 on the basis of good intelligence that an attack was imminent by both countries. Interestingly enough, it turns out that post-war intelligence suggested that the attack was not imminent, that it was a bluff, and that, in fact, Egypt really wanted to preserve the status quo with the UN troops out, blocking of the Gulfs of Tehran, and so Israel may have acted reasonably and erroneously in '67, and a perfect example of the failure to act preemptively wrongly was Israel's failure to attack the same armies in '73, when it had less good intelligence because the new president of Egypt tried to hide his interest in attacking, and Israel's failure to preempt cost it thousands of lives, as a subsequent evaluation by the United States Army established. So preemption is when you're simply anticipating an imminent, certain, and very, very serious attack. Prevention is very different, and I think the examples that were used by, not Professor, but Mr. Rifkin, were primarily preventive rather than preemptive. The Cuban Missile Crisis was clearly preventive. The war in Iraq was preventive, not preemptive. There was no information suggesting the use of nuclear weapons of mass destruction in an imminent way. Many of the wars that we think about, or the attacks, are preventive, not preemptive. And I think one has to keep in mind the distinction. Now, I want to argue that imminence should not be the sole criteria for intervention. I'll give you another example from the Middle East, and the reason I'm coming up with so many examples from Israel is Israel has developed preemption and prevention to a much greater degree as part of its strategy than probably any other country, because it's so small and its borders are so vulnerable, and it has had to use preemption and prevention. The attack by Israel on the Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981 was not an attack based on preemption. There was no imminence. Indeed, it was not even certain that Iraq would develop nuclear weapons, but the catastrophic nature of the potential risk was so great that it trumped issues of imminence and even issues of certainty. Although the United States joined the international community in virtually unanimously condemning Israel, Israel was condemned by the Security Council with the vote of the United States. I think today most scholars, including liberal scholars who are generally not favorable toward preemption, Anne-Marie Slaughter, for example, views the Israeli attack on Osirak as a paradigm of appropriate prevention. So again, prevention and preemption, and when is each appropriate? Can, in fact, the jurisprudence be evolved for determining in advance, ex ante, when such an attack is appropriate? Or is it always going to be a totality of the circumstances, and will it depend on subjective views of the risks? One can even use learned hands' old formula of the seriousness of the risk discounted by the improbability of its occurrence as a way of looking at how a jurisprudence might begin to evolve. What I worry about mostly is the law that applies more importantly than any international law or any United Nations law, and that is the law of unintended consequences. And that is not knowing what you're wielding when you engage in preventive actions based on issues other than imminence and absolute certainty. Now, of course, the UN Charter doesn't give a lot of options. The UN Charter is utterly anachronistic and utterly useless. It talks about wanting the ability to respond militarily only to armed attack. That would, of course, make Israel's preemptive attack improper in '67. It would make it impossible for any country to attack, even if a nuclear attack was certain and imminent, until the first bomb hit. And even the Security Council of the United Nations, in this report, is now seriously considering revising. And the recommendation, chaired by the former Foreign Minister of Australia, comes up with a recommendation saying imminence, yes, that is, preemption appropriate, prevention never appropriate. And the reason it comes to this distinction, which I myself don't buy, is that imminence and preemption never give an opportunity for the Security Council to become involved, whereas prevention, by nature, because the threat is not imminent, gives you an opportunity, gives the potential victim state an opportunity to go to the Security Council, and in their naivete or in their willful blindness, the people writing this report say, of course the Security Council will be responsive and will take action, therefore there's never any need for unilateral prevention. And that doesn't pass the giggle test, as we all know. The Security Council has never been able to intervene in a timely fashion, whether to prevent imminent attack or to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. You'd think that preemption in the humanitarian context would be something, or prevention, that the Security Council would be pretty effective at, because the stakes aren't as high, the antagonisms aren't as great, and there surely should be a consensus that genocide, starvation, ethnic cleansing is something the world is committed to prevent, and yet the United Nations Security Council particularly has been absolutely impotent in the face of even genocidal threats. So to ask a country to violate what Dean Acheson once said, and that is, he said, survival of a nation is never a matter of law, to ask any country to expect a legal resolution to a threat which it deems to be relatively certain, relatively imminent, and relatively catastrophic, because these are all going to be matters of degree, is to ask too much. So I think the United Nations Charter clearly has to be amended. The other point that I think has to be made is one thinks of this as a debate between prevention and preemption on the one hand, that is anticipatory self-defense, and deterrence on the other hand. And I think there's actually a better argument for preemption and prevention than the ones that were offered by David Rifkin. And so let me offer one and then offer at least a partial response to it. By its very nature, deterrence always involves the killing of civilians. Because how do you deter? What was our theory of deterrence during the Cold War? It was mutually assured destruction. Hey, Soviets, you bomb New York and kill 6, 7, 8 million people. We'll bomb Moscow and kill 10 million people. That's what mutually assured destruction is. That's what deterrence is. And that's illegal under international law. Under international law, you cannot retaliate against the killing of your civilians by killing other people's civilians. The entire theory of deterrence under international law is unlawful. And indeed, as many of you know probably, the International Court of Justice had a case about a dozen years ago asking it whether nuclear threats are legal under international law, and surprise, surprise, it could come to no resolution on that issue. It split 5-5 and couldn't even resolve whether a country faced with destruction of its very being had the right to retaliate in a nuclear way. The American judge dissenting, saying, if you can't answer that question, what good are you as a court? So the very issue of whether deterrence is even lawful is a question, but deterrence almost always involves the threat to kill and the killing of civilians. Preemption and prevention, on the other hand, can be very selective, focused, and targeted. As, again, the Israeli experience and I think the Cuban Missile Crisis experience point out, Israel didn't attack civilian population centers in '67. It attacked the Air Force on the ground. It didn't attack civilian population centers in '81 at Osirak. It attacked a nuclear reactor. And the United States did not threaten to blow up downtown Havana. It threatened to attack by its own rockets the nuclear facilities, which are appropriate military targets. So preemption and prevention has the advantage of focusing on military rather than civilian targets. But the end result, of course, is under international law today, deterrence is unlawful, and preemption is unlawful, and prevention is unlawful. Under international law, and particularly under the Charter of the United Nations, basically you have to wait to be attacked. That wasn't even good policy in 1945. It surely is not good policy in 2005 with the threats of terrorism and the threats of nuclear reaction. So we don't have a fundamental disagreement here about the potentials for the use of preemption or prevention. I think our disagreement is one of nuance, one of priorities, and one of prudence and care. I think the difference is I was against the war in Iraq. By the way, I was against the war in Iraq 51 to 49%, and I said it before the war. For me, it was a close question. It was not a marchable event. I would not protest the war in Iraq the way I did the war in Vietnam. I thought it was a very close question. I believe there were weapons of mass destruction. And I also believe, by the way, that the President and the administration believe that. I don't think they deceived. I'm not one of those liberal Democrats who believe there was conscious deception. I think everybody made a mistake, and I think the mistake was an honest one. I also thought there was a very strong case for taking out the dictatorial leader. And I, in fact, favored, though I oppose military invasion and occupation, I favored the first night of the war, the attempt to target and kill Saddam Hussein. I would have supported that with great enthusiasm as a preventive action. So I think one has to look at different levels of prevention and preemption. In general, I'm much more supportive of preemption and prevention that's singular, that's focused, that's targeted, and that can destroy the ability of the enemy to respond quickly. But I think that preventive wars, full military invasions cum occupation, raise very, very, very different kind of issues. And that's why, though I was 51-49 against the war in Iraq before it started, I'm now 80-20 against the war. But I have no right to make that argument, because you have to look at the situation ex ante and not be the Monday morning quarterback. But I think one can strongly oppose the preventive nature of a continued occupation. Again, the alternatives are not very great. And by the way, when we're dealing with issues of deterrence, prevention, preemption, we're dealing in my area as a criminal lawyer. Why? Because I live in a world never of good, better, best, but always worse, worser, worsest. And I think those are the options that we face when we have to choose between deterrence, preemption, and prevention. So my final point is, yes, preemption when appropriate, rarely, if ever, prevention, and a great deal of caution, particularly in applying longer-term prevention. Thank you.
We'll now hear from each of the panelists for 5 minutes in rebuttal of each other, beginning with Mr. Rivkin.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. It's always challenging to engage Professor Dershowitz even in his weakened state. And for the first few minutes, I listened with some sinking feeling, thinking I was told to engender some level of controversy and disagreement, especially after you heard such lively exchanges in the previous panel. And I was thinking, what the hell are we going to disagree about? But I think Professor Dershowitz's last 5 minutes have rescued me from this predicament. Let me spend my 5 minutes making a couple of probably pedantic observations, and one serious one. Pedantic because I used to be a defense analyst before I became a lawyer. In many respects, this is still my first love. First, deterrence being based on mutually assured destruction. Professor Dershowitz actually was never an American position. We have always maintained that deterrence would be based upon a variety of targeting regimes and strategic concepts ranging from counterforce to counter-economic targeting, were pretty much consistent with traditional use and bellow notion that you cannot attack civilians directly, but as long as the levels of destruction you inflict are proportionate and consistent with the military advantage you seek, that is collateral damage. Now, I'm not sort of arguing that is the newfangled Protocol 1 additional view, but under the traditional use and bellow, that was perfectly correct in a fight for national survival. I would say, not to sound too grand, for the survival of liberty, and it may sound like Dr. Strangelove, I do like the movie, by the way, to carry out a nuclear strike that would result in the deaths of 20, 30, 50 million Soviet civilians who were totally innocent, but not deliberately targeting them as such. The Europeans, by the way, and a number of our own strategists felt that actually made nuclear war more likely and therefore was immoral as well as illegal. Of course, we can see who's won on that issue. Second, I really don't want to spend time. In fact, I was very happy until the last couple of minutes because I said, God, I'm happy we're not going to have one of those sterile parsing the UN Charter, Article 51 versus Article 2.4, and state practice, and did the Charter supplant customary international law. Let me just be provocative and say, please accept at least that there's a strong contrary argument that UN Charter is utterly permissive, utterly non-prescriptive. It did not supplant the customary rule of international law. It allows anticipatory defense, full stop, and we can talk about it. And as a matter of fact, state practice is absolutely clear, whether it's 61, whether it's Ozark, whether it's 56. One of my favorites because it involved Britain and France. 56, the Suez Crisis. The justification was that the Egyptian nationalization of a canal was going to adversely affect the economy, global economy, because already political correctness seeping in. They didn't feel comfortable saying it's going to adversely affect British and French economy. They said world economy. Well, that argument makes, the Japanese justification with Pearl Harbor about how economic, sanctions were strangling them seemed like a model of close nexus. But that's not particularly interesting, as I said. These are pedantic differences and reasonable people can disagree about it. Ironically enough, though, on the key issue of, preemption versus prevention, and Professor Dershowitz supporting easy and clean and neat, sort of decapitating types of attacks more, I am more of a pessimist. My sense is that any venture in the realm of force is, if hopefully short and low blood and very decapitating, can escalate and produce bad results. And one should never get on the escalatory ladder just because you think you're going to get away with it. Do it only if you assume that the stakes are sufficiently high, the consequences of inaction are sufficiently grave, that they're fully sufficient to purchase, to offset, whatever verb you want to use, the full cost, the most horrible consequences of the war. That's not I wish it were my insight, but if you look at the writings of early, deterrence, by the way, is ancient, but there's a generation of brilliant American strategists, people like Herman Kahn and Brody and Kissinger in part. And basically, you just don't get up on this whole ladder. You don't send one plane to take out one target if you think that if things turn badly and you escalate all the way to the top, but you wouldn't do it. Ironically enough, with all due respect to Professor Dershowitz, that's some of a criticism of some of my neoconservative friends who really supported the war because they felt they're going to be greeted as liberators and we're not going to lose 1,400 plus guys and thousands of people wounded, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's just rubbish. You have to assume that it was going to escalate into a real war. But the consequences, we as lawyers appreciate, while law makes distinction between action and inaction. Strategy does not. And if the consequences of inaction are sufficiently grave, you do it. One final point. It is often easier, ladies and gentlemen, to predict the long-term strategic trends. Ironically enough, as Iraq proves, you can be very wrong at the tactical level. You may be very wrong about strategic stockpiles. What was the actual state of Saddam Hussein's stockpiles of WMDs? Far easier to predict long-term problems. So in many respects, from a probabilistic perspective, paraphrasing Judge Loney Hands, the discount is far higher with short-term preemption than long-term prevention. Thank you.
First, on the issue of deterrence, although the United States policy to Americans may have been, look, we won't bomb the center of Moscow, all we'll bomb is the suburbs where they keep their nuclear facilities and hope to keep the numbers of casualties down. To the Soviets, the message was clearly, or at least ambiguously, that look what we did to Hiroshima, look what we did to Nagasaki, look what we did to Dresden, believe me, we will do it to you. And we used that again in the first Gulf War, and there's evidence of it. In the first Gulf War, the Iraqis were actually loading chemical weapons onto their trucks. And this appears in the dissenting opinion of Judge Schwebel in the case. And when the American Secretary of State went and told the foreign minister of Iraq that we will nuke downtown Baghdad, we will bring out the big guns, that's when they took their rockets off the back of the truck. So that was an instance where deterrent worked, and it worked because we threatened to do something clearly illegal. At least they perceived the threat in a way that was illegal. And for deterrence to work, that's the way it has to be perceived. There's an interesting intermediate category. Sometimes retaliation is designed as preventive. Let me give you an example of something that's in the news today where it could conceivably happen. There is something will have to be done to retaliate against the terrorist attack last night in Tel Aviv. One possibility is for either the United States or Israel or both to retaliate against Iran. Iran, after all, probably perpetrated the attack last night through its puppet Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad. And in many respects, it would be far better for Israel not to retaliate against the Palestinian Authority or Palestinians because there is a peace process ongoing and a truce is in place, and it may not have been the fault of the Palestinians. But to attack Syria or to attack Iran might have the imprimatur of retaliation, but the goal of prevention. In Lebanon, preventing continued Syrian involvement in Lebanese domestic affairs, and in Iran, if the targeting were permissible, and one doesn't know whether the targeting is possible, attacking the nuclear reactor or reactors. So there are mixed pictures of retaliation and deterrence and prevention all at the same time. A couple of brief points. You mentioned 1956 Suez. I don't think there was any justification for what Israel, what France, or what England did. That was a purely preventive and wrong war, and I think that the international community appropriately condemned all three parties who engaged in that war. So one has to, I think, pick one example very carefully. You can find justification for almost anything in state action. But I think one has to look for examples that world opinion has ultimately justified. And so Osirak, yes. Suez, no. And what I hope we can do today during the question-and-answer period is try to evolve something like a jurisprudence to replace the Charter of the United Nations, which you think is not operative. Whether it's operative or not, we both agree is irrelevant. I don't like your jurisprudence. I think it's too permissive. You don't like my jurisprudence. You think it's too restrictive. But I think it would be very useful, because I agree with you that the one thing we do agree on, it's very important to articulate these issues, to debate them in advance in a democracy, and to decide when it is appropriate and when it's not appropriate to use these extraordinary means of preemption and prevention. I still think the default position, the norm, should not be preemption or prevention. That one who preempts or prevents should have the burden of justification. And whereas deterrence carries with it no burden, because everybody is entitled to announce a policy of deterrence, and then you use it in a self-justifying way. Whereas preemption and prevention require justification. And so what I hope will come out during the question and answer period is how to justify it, how you would create a jurisprudence, how you would write a charter provision for international law or the UN, which would say when yes, when no.
We will now take some questions if people would like to line up at the microphones, and I'll begin by asking a question to Professor Dershowitz. My question for Professor Dershowitz is, given that the Iranian regime is well known as to be a sponsor of terrorism and of terrorist organizations, given that it appears to be trying very hard to develop nuclear weapons and to be on the verge of developing nuclear weapons, and given that the regime shows no respect for human rights within its own borders and it treats its own people in a way that is totally disrespectful of human rights, what more do you think would have to happen before a preemptive strike by the United States or Israel against Iran's nuclear capability would be warranted?
Well, I think there are two questions, warranted and wise. I think, in fact, the nuclear strike against Iran would be warranted, justified, as soon as it became clear that there was a calendar for when they were going to develop a capacity to use their Shahid rockets with a nuclear tip. That would be the warranted. Wise is different. Why? Because the internal dynamics in Iran are very complicated. There is actually a democracy movement. There is actually a chance that there could be internal change. And the one thing that 98% of Iranians would agree to is that they should have the right to have nuclear weapons. That is a unifying fact. We would undercut the democracy movement in Iran by engaging in a preemptive act, which we would be warranted in engaging in. So it's very important to distinguish between our right to do so, the justification for doing so, which almost exists if it doesn't already exist, and the wisdom of doing so, and those have to be weighed against each other.
Gentleman over there.
Okay. Brock Taylor, Harvard Law School. So I went to a conference at Tufts earlier this year on preemption. It seemed like the only intelligible policy prescription was the learned hand formula of redefining imminence as level of catastrophe times level of probability, and then making a determination based on something based on that. Could you talk about the pluses and minuses of that calculus?
Well, this is actually a reasonable formulation in addition to learned Hans code that Professor Dershowitz has adduced. There is a, of course, if you studied international law, there's a famous Caroline doctrine that many people have viewed as sort of embodying a restrictive formulation that threat had to be imminent, leaving no room for deliberation, blah, 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 blah. And of course, if you have a trivial threat, and the threat involved in the Caroline doctrine, Caroline incident, excuse me, was fairly trivial, then you can afford to wait until things become far more unambiguous. Again, I would submit to you, at least my concern is that we are making myopic assumptions about the ability of intelligence and our ability to predict those things, and apropos the observation made by Professor Dershowitz was entirely reasonable, entirely unobjectionable. We'll probably never be able to refine it to that level of specificity, and it's even a mistake to try because, I mean, despite, not to preempt a lot of other discussions that are going on about the mistakes involved, intelligence mistakes involved, for example, in Iran, in Iraq, there's always inherent tension between over-connecting the dots, think about it for a second, and under-connecting the dots. 9/11 is a failure to be creative and step out of a box, and you under-connected the dots. The Iraqi thing, and we don't have time to get into why it was reasonable to assume what Saddam Hussein was building this stuff, because he had the bloody thing and used them in the past. It's just impossible. So I think I would err more on the side of focusing on the consequences of allowing the threat to mature. Yes, probably I would use force more than Alan in that situation. But I frankly think one of the problems, again, responding to your invitation about what is the right paradigm, I think the problem of international law, but it seems to assume that all actors are equal, and the risk of sounding very quaint and very simplistic, I think the good guys using force should be subject to an entirely different regime than bad guys using force, just like the law makes distinction domestically between the cops using force and criminals using force. So I really think the burden should be on the bad guys to prove that they're being kosher, but they don't have anything. In arms control theory, you call it confidence-building measures. So basically, if you're a rogue regime, if you oppress your people, you better pray that you convince us that you're not up to no good, because if you don't, it may be wise to attack you, assuming some practical things can be worked out.
Of course, the question is who decides who are the good guys and the bad guys. In this room, that's not a hard decision to make. In a room in the Sorbonne, I think the decision would be quite different. I mean, when you hear arguments, how come we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon and we allow Israel to have one? Because Israel's not going to use it, and Iran is. We know that, but in the Sorbonne they don't know that, or they pretend not to know it. And so one of the problems of international law is whether you can have a single rule of law for all countries, or you really do have to have a look at kind of recidivism, history, how countries use. And of course, in the Sorbonne, they would remind us that the only country ever to drop a nuclear bomb is our country, and therefore, by any objective standard, it's very hard to do this. In my forthcoming book, I try to take the Lerner Hand formulation and break it up into first about 10 different sub-formulations. I actually then try to assign numbers, and I try to quantify it, because I always think that heuristically it's very interesting to quantify, but I'm not a member of the Law and Economics Club, and so I then, after I quantify, I acknowledge that quantification is always going to be rough, and I go back to fuzzy logic, and try, however, to look at a variety of formulations, and if anyone afterward want to see my very complicated formulations, they go well beyond the Lerner Hand simple formulation, but none of them will ever fit any particular issue exactly directly. I acknowledge that. But by the way, that's true of many legal formulations, even under domestic law. If you look at self-defense, we have one law of self-defense for everybody and one law of anticipatory self-defense for everybody, but clearly, in practice, it should depend on a lot of factors that the law has a very great difficulty incorporating into a formulation.
Over here.
Jessie Tannenbaum, Notre Dame Law School. My question is for Professor Dershowitz. You seem to me to be proposing, notwithstanding your proposal to actually reform international law in the UN Charter, you seem to be proposing that states should or even need to sometimes disregard current international law with respect to deterrence, prevention, and preemption in the interest of their own security. I agree with you, but the counterargument that we often hear from liberals and supporters of international law is that this sets a dangerous international precedent and also sets a bad example for the international community and what we like to call rogue states, and is therefore bad policy. How would you respond to that argument?
Well, first of all, the argument for international law in general is a complex one because there is no kind of Rawlsian or Jeffersonian or Hamiltonian ingredient to international law. There is taxation without representation, essentially. And it's very hard to change international law once it's formulated. I would much prefer to see international law written in a way that permits us to abide by it. I don't think that's true today. I think that democracies are at a very significant disadvantage in fighting terrorism because of the post-World War II conceptions of international law. I would like to see that change, and I'd like to see the United States take the lead in trying to reformulate international law. I'd like to see it create, for example, what I call a continuum of civilianality, rather than an absolute line between civilian and military. With terrorism, there are civilian-like and military-like people in the middle. In the previous panel, people were talking about states, failed states, semi-states, terrorist groups. All of this has to be taken into account in a new international law. Also, the potential for weapons of mass destruction being smuggled into all of these things do not today figure in international law, unless you accept David's formulation, which is that the UN Charter is not really international law, but that international law is really common law that changes with the actions of states, and that gives you more of an opportunity to flexibly change international law in an ongoing way.
If I could just say one thing. I didn't mean to suggest that, and if that's how it came off, I erred. My point is that you construe you construe the UN Charter the same way you construe the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, not in isolation, but looking at the previous incarnations. And the UN Charter is part and parcel of a broad body of international law. And again, myself and many other people have written a number of articles parsing the UN Charter and saying that in sort of an absolutist construction of Article 51 doesn't make sense. I mean, if you look at Article 51, it certainly doesn't make sense if you look at the wording of Article 2.4, which says that all members should refrain in their international relations from a threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state when any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. That broad prescription, nuanced, fairly hortatory language would be utterly redundant if the only way you can use force legitimately would be in response to an armed attack on your territory pursuant to UN sanctions. But that's not interesting. The other point, very briefly, as I mentioned in my remarks, I don't buy the whole action-reaction thing, maybe because of my background as a former defense and arms control type. Historically, it never worked, despite all the academic obsessions about instabilities. You know, Pakistan with exception of World War I, I cannot think about more than a couple of other crises where you had the sort of instabilities caused by preemptive hair-trigger posture. And I can think about many instances like World War II, where the real thing that caused the problems was weakness perceived by the bad guys and failure to take military action in a timely fashion.
Well, let me just add to that. The greatest example of the failure of preemption, and I'm quoting an eminent statesman now, Joseph Goebbels, who said, "We were shocked, the Nazis, that the French and the English didn't take preemptive action against us while we were still weak. We fully anticipated it. We never thought," he said, "we would ever be able to arm to the point where we could defeat the French and the English, and if they had taken preventive, it wouldn't have been preemptive action early in the 1930s when our goals became clear, Nazism never would have been able to bring about the horrors that it did in the Second World War."
A 10-second vignette. Believe it or not, I've heard German officials, shall we say, who are not particularly friendly towards this country, argue this was all a perfidious intent on our part, that we could have taken down Hitler early, but we're really desirous of hurting the German nation. We allowed him to rise, so did the British, and then we took them down at the cost of, 30-plus million lives.
Over here.
Joe Wolf, University of Wisconsin Law School. I was actually a platoon leader during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the hardest part of being a platoon leader... Thank you. And one of the most difficult parts, I thought, of the deployment was when the Spanish decided to leave. My question is mostly about NATO. One is, we've talked about the UN becoming irrelevant. This is for Mr. Rifkin, actually. Now has NATO become irrelevant? And you talked about asserting ourselves, how that has strengthened our deterrent effect. Is losing NATO and the UN going to actually weaken our deterrence effect in being able to contain a prolonged military occupation?
This is a very complex question. First of all, I don't buy the argument we've lost the UN. I think the UN is the way its founders intended it to operate, never operate. I don't know if you know that, but do you know that the Security Council has never, ever found a threat to peace within the meaning of Chapter 7. On 2 occasions, including the Gulf War and Korea, they mentioned that there was threat to peace, at least that's the way to parse it, but then basically said you can exercise your collective self-defense right for which you don't need the UN imprimatur. The UN has never functioned the way it's supposed to function, so I don't think that we particularly broke it. It was kind of broke to begin with. NATO is a complex issue. I think the jury is still out. We are obviously paying a cost. And I think some of our conservative supporters of the administration are wrong in acting as if who cares what old Europe thinks or who cares what toll it's taken on NATO. I think NATO is not yet broken. Incidentally, why is it just us? Do you know that for years our French friends have been very much against NATO? It's interesting. They didn't mind bilateral provision to Turkey, a NATO member, of AWACS aircraft and other equipment to protect them, and it was mostly symbolic because there's no real threat from Saddam Hussein in the early days leading to the Gulf War. They did not want it done for NATO. They did not want, up until the last minute, to have training being done.
And around the world have been caused by showings of weakness, and also, you know, the contrary statements by Professor Dershowitz that he believes every attack we take should be as limited as possible, aimed at decapitating. I was just wondering how both of you would respond to an article I saw, and the topic was something to the gist of limited war is unjust war. And basically the argument that was made is that inflicting heavy civilian casualties intentionally, CF Dresden, would have prevented the insurgency that we're currently experiencing in Iraq, would have acted as a primary deterrent to them, and basically would have scared them into not conducting the insurgency that they are, and I was just wondering how either of you would respond to that.
This is actually, let me just pull it off. It's a very controversial and difficult issue. You have some Air Force serving officers, written articles in professional journals arguing, and I wouldn't mention names since these arguments are not always career-enhancing in the current political correctness environment. But apropos of Professor Dershowitz's point about decapitation and clean strikes and clean preemption, which certainly 67 is a perfect example of it, and my rejoinder that I am a pessimist by nature and most things happen very rarely, what you are talking about, of arguments you are alluding to, are this: when you're dealing with societies that have not just an individually bad guy, but kind of an evil clique ruling it, inflicting a heavy punishment on that society is essential to avoid costly counterinsurgency. And one of the reasons we did not have counterinsurgency, even cultural issues aside, insurgency in Germany, is because we pummeled the hell out of Germany. And, you know, you basically, bulk of German men of fighting age were killed or wounded or shell-shocked, and we had a lot of guys on the ground. So there are people who argue that this is the famous, you know, catastrophic success, that is because we did not punish enough for Sunni Triangle, and these guys were sufficiently ticked off to resort to insurgency, but not sufficiently awed that they didn't do enough shock and awe. I understand this argument intellectually. Unfortunately, this is where I'll be eclectic and say we have to pay attention to the decent opinions of mankind. The world is moving towards, and I've written about it in ad nauseum and others as well, towards zero collateral damage. I mean, the amount of collateral damage we inflict now is so discriminate and so proportionate. I don't have time to get into it, but literally every time you use firepower, you play with things to make sure that you would kill the minimum number of civilians, even though that's not what to me, traditional jus in bello norms allow for. So to swing back and say, well, look, if we kill 20,000 civilians here, we would cow into submission this entire restive heartland of Iraq. Interesting intellectual argument over beer, but it's not something we can embrace, even for me, as a matter of public policy, because it would backfire. It would be like advocating torture.
Well, as one who has, at least the torture art, I think that it's a no-brainer. I think it's wrong empirically. I don't think that massively causing casualties is a way of stopping an insurgency. You know, it's the old argument about if you really want to stop dissent in a country, you have to really do it the way Stalin and Hitler did it. You can't do it the way moderate dictators do it. You have to just kill all the dissidents. I mean, you know, there's a point when that becomes true, but surely we're unable to do that kind of thing. And in fact, it's not part of United States policy. Even when Israel surrounded the Egyptian army in '73 and could have destroyed the entire army, not the, which would have been perfectly appropriate, the United States stopped it from doing so, and for good reason, because there's a future. Israel had to make peace with Egypt, and I don't think you make peace with a country after you've destroyed so many of its soldiers. The Second World War may not be the paradigm. First of all, we didn't do most of the killing in the Second World War. We had an ally, quote, to the east that did most of the killing of the Germans. We just got the advantages of it. And I think that we have to maintain our approach that using international law that limits attack on civilians is good for America, it's good for the world, and we have to maintain it. My own view, and here I know it's not a popular view among many, I think that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were an absolute moral disaster. Certainly the second bombing of Nagasaki was an absolute disaster. I don't take the same view necessarily of Dresden, and I think it did compromise our moral standing in the world. I would have a hard time pointing to concrete disadvantages that it brought about to the United States. So if you take purely a realpolitik point of view, I would have a harder time arguing against it than if you balance realpolitik against morality. But we willfully and deliberately killed tens and thousands of wholly innocent people, babies, the elderly, people who didn't necessarily themselves support the Japanese regime. Now that's punishment for being in the wrong country, which started the wrong war at the wrong time. Let me give you an interesting quotation. When Begin, who was the prime minister, very conservative prime minister, during the Osirak reactor, he said one reason he had to go preemptive is because once Iraq had heated up the nuclear reactor, he would not have ordered its destruction because, quote, we are not at war with the children of Baghdad. He would not have authorized it. He even went further and said, had Israel been attacked by an Iraqi nuclear weapon, he would not have authorized, he was a Holocaust survivor, he would not have authorized the nuclear bombing of Baghdad. And this, again, supports my view, I think, that to the extent preemption can be associated with attacking only military targets, that is one of its advantages over deterrence, which, notwithstanding how you want to spin it, will inevitably cause more civilian casualties than preemption.
Over here.
David Sheffrin, Penn Law. Let me give the flip side, which is the U.S. has an executive order and has had since I believe '76 that specifically prohibits the U.S. from assassinating foreign leaders, which it would seem to me is a way to deter or prevent with zero civilian casualties. Do you think we should revise this order?
No, that's actually very easy. The term assassination is a term of art in international law. It refers to a killing of internationally protected persons, and only is relevant, and there are issues, of course, who is an internationally protected person. Guys like bin Laden are never an internationally protected person. But in wartime, anybody in the target of command, in a chain of command, is a legitimate target. So it's not okay to whack the health minister of Iraq, but killing the commander-in-chief, which was Saddam Hussein, was, more or less effectively, was a perfectly legitimate thing. But again, let me just indulge myself for 30 seconds and point out, one of the reasons it's such a complex thing, if you look at some of the analysis of why we did both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we had fewer than 4 atomic devices. And there are people who argued that we shouldn't even do Hiroshima, we should just do one test. The counter to that was if we did the test and the Japanese did not take it seriously, we had really 2. One at that point in time was fully assembled left. And the reason we did Nagasaki was because there was a failure to respond by Japanese, and there was a desire by people here to act as if we had a whole bunch, because the perception was that if Japanese knew that after we did Hiroshima and Nagasaki we were pretty much left with nothing, you still would have had to invade the home islands and millions of people would have died. So what's interesting here is, and again, what history Professor Dershowitz was describing is certainly one interpretation. Even when you talk about the past, it's difficult to figure out what was right and what was wrong. Think about how tough it is for the future.
Well, it seems to me if you have 4 bombs, you drop the first one on a relatively isolated island, send a clear message that the second one is going to wherever an appropriate military target around Tokyo would be. There are other ways of achieving that. In terms of killing an assassination, I want to make my point very clear. I favor extrajudicial killings. What I don't favor are judicial killings. Why don't I favor judicial killings? Because I'm an opponent of the death penalty. And whenever you have a judicial killing, you have an alternative of locking the person up for life. Extrajudicial killings, which are condemned all the time by unthinking people, include self-defense, killing of fleeing felons, and all other kinds of preventive actions when there is no alternative, when the only alternative is far greater harm. So if you have the right target and you can prevent many, many deaths by killing the right target, I don't care if he's the head of state or anybody else, and whether it's wartime or not wartime, you have to do a cost-benefit calculus. And if you can decapitate the right terrorist or the right leader at the right time with minimum civilian casualties, it seems to me that's the way to go.
Over there.
Good evening. I feel compelled to admit that I am my name is Michael Negron, and I am a board member of the Harvard Law School chapter of the American Constitution Society. So I will say that you all have been very gracious hosts. Get it out, get it out, get it out. And my question is primarily a policy question, so I'm sorry to take it away from the legal focus of the discussion thus far. But given that I think there's probably going to be considerable agreement that our military structure is probably not capable of engaging in a similar kind of operation for at least several years, given the cost of the operation itself and then the post-conflict operations of occupation and reconstruction. And I'm also assuming, Mr. Rifkin, that this is the type of preemptive or preventative operation that you believe can be a legitimate instrument of policy that we can use again, given when we meet your standard criteria for that kind of use of force. What sort of long-term force structure would we need to actually make this a legitimate instrument of policy in which we can actually apply it if we face a series of threats in succession? I don't think you're going to find much disagreement here that we could not, say, engage in a similar operation in Iran or North Korea right now because we simply don't have the force structure to do this. So people are serving multiple tours of duty right now in a high-conflict, high-stress operation. So I'm not sure. I'd like to hear your belief as to what the long-term force structure has to be in order to make this a legitimate use of force, institutionalized and able to repeat as a threat necessitates.
That's a good question. In fact, there is a school of thought out there that basically says we, having exercised preemption once, we sort of preempted against future preemptions. Right. I would submit to you that it certainly seems like that. We are very much engaged in the ground, and we're incapable of sustaining another major operation of law. I can point out to you that there's certainly uses of force against countries like Syria in a situation we don't want to do a regime change, but we actually want to make them pay and get out of Lebanon. We could use some air power in ways that are not particularly constrained right now. But we don't have 2 hours to talk about the force structure. Ironically enough, because again, I like Professor Dershowitz, I happen to think that if you're going to use preemption, just like happened, or prevention, whatever you want to call it, just like happened in Iraq, we found ourselves in a full-fledged war. Instead of being treated as liberators, you develop a force structure and doctrine that enables you to wage high-intensity combat operations against some pretty pathetic people, like the Iraqi military, against some more serious people. I think Iranians would be more formidable. North Koreans would be extremely formidable. You supplement that with some serious counterinsurgency capabilities and some, some better intelligence capabilities. It's all going to cost a hell of a lot of money. Thank God I don't have to worry where to come up with that. But you basically don't need to tweak your force structure in a way that's particularly optimized for preemption, because again, to me, a preemption is just an opening salvo, and I assume that it would devolve more or less in a major war.
But I think it's important, when you're going to use preemption with full military invasion and occupation, you darn well better have picked your target right. If it turns out that we should have taken preventive action against a country starting with I in the Middle East, but we picked the wrong country, that it should have been Iran rather than Iraq, and if we are precluded from doing it in Iran because we made the mistake of doing it in Iraq, we will pay a very, very heavy price for that. And it's not about structure of forces, though that's relevant. It is about making the choices very, very carefully. Now, we had a reason to believe that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. But if it turns out we were wrong about that, and that Iran really poses the greatest risk to America and its allies through developing weapons of mass destruction, and we are precluded from going in, because I agree with you that preemption is one of these things you can't use a lot. In fact, one reason Israel didn't use preemption in '73 is because it used it in '67. And it is a limited resource, and therefore one of the reasons that dictate prudence is a very hawkish reason. Don't use it when you don't need it, because you may have to use it when you really do need it.
We are out of time, but I'd like to recognize Tessa Platt to make an announcement, and I'd like to thank our debaters.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you all for attending. For those of you registered for the banquet, there are actually 2 ways to get there. You can take the T, the public transportation. It's only 2 stops, $1.25. It's a good deal. We'll also have some cabs out by Pound Hall at 6:30. Thank you very much.
There's a whole argument, by the way. The reason we did Iraq is because we could do Iraq plausibly, we cannot do Iraq.
No, I think that's right. I think there is something to that.
Michael,
if I send this to you, could you keep it to yourself and then tell me any good suggestions? I would love that.
Really
I would
great.
do that. I would send it to you soon. Okay, good. Thank you.
And also a formal
I very much enjoyed your debate. That was terrific. Great job.
Find a mentor. Find a one or two people. By the way, you're wearing the Federalist uniform.
I don't take me, but
Earth tones. You're wearing the uniform here. I mean, it would be